Let me start very quickly the same way I did yesterday. This is an action conference. We are here not just to learn, but to act, and act as a part of a commitment that we share. This is about Hanford and the river. Both are important symbols. The river is a symbol of life, the life of the earth, the life of living things, the life of people. And Hanford is a symbol of death. Death of our environment, death of living things, death of people. We are here because for 50 years we have seen cover-up, deceit, lies, social irresponsibility by our government and the leadership of this country, and half a century is more than too much. Too many people have died, too many more people are going to die unless and until major remedial, responsible changes are made. It's therefore particularly pleasing to have as our first guest this morning somebody who hopefully, in my view at least, and I hope in most of yours, will be a member of Congress. It is much easier for him today, not as yet a member of Congress, to tell us everything we want to hear. But I am saying to him that I will be his conscience, and I hope every one of us will be his conscience if he does not stand up on the floor of Congress and say, Hanford must be destroyed. Just as for years, who was it? Cato? No, somebody. Cicero said, Carthage must be destroyed. No, seriously, that was the theme. There is no more important theme for somebody from this part of the world to do than to call attention to it every day in Congress until this monstrous blasphemy of life is destroyed. Brian Baird has a good background for this kind of question. He's a clinical psychologist. He teaches at the Department of Psychology at POU. He's a member of appropriate professional organizations and in science ones. And he ran a very good and exciting race last time, saying some very, very good things. So we're very hopeful and happy to have you with us today.
Thanks very much. I want to welcome you to the 3rd Congressional District, which is where we are today. If you want to talk about Hanford and particularly the Columbia River, you're talking to a significant degree about the 3rd Congressional District, because this district goes all the way up the gorge, goes up to Lyle in Klickitat County, and as you follow the river down past White Salmon, past Vancouver, then you go farther, the river heads north, goes by Kalama, Longview, out to the coast, Ilwaco, and then actually, even though it joins the Pacific Ocean there, the impact of Hanford doesn't end there, because of course the waters head on up north and move into the Willapa Bay and up by Westport. So the river runs through it as an appropriate theme for this conference, and it's certainly an appropriate theme for our district. You know, as I was coming in this morning, I had 2 regrets. The first is that I can't join you for the entire conference because the makeup of the speakers is outstanding. And the second is that I was listening to the radio. How many of you are from around here? Okay, well, some of you know. The Republican National Committee has launched a $700,000 attack ad campaign on me. And it's pretty hard to turn your radio or your TV on and not see these attack pieces. And they always end with the following: call Brian Baird, right? This is the mantra of this party. So it occurred to me that next attack ad is going to say something like this: on October 3rd, Brian Baird spoke at a Hanford cleanup meeting. On October 4th, there was still radioactivity at Hanford. Call Brian Baird and tell him to clean it up. It is, whatever you do in politics, there are consequences, and as someone once said, no good deed goes unpunished. But on a more serious note, why isn't Hanford being cleaned up more quickly? I'm not as the person who kindly introduced me said, I'm not here to say Hanford must be destroyed. I'm here to say it must be cleaned up. And the question is, why is it not being cleaned up faster? When you have millions of people living downriver and impacted by it every day, why isn't it being cleaned up? Now, I know one of your speakers talked about this the other day, but I want to share a couple thoughts, both from my perspective as a political candidate and what some of you may not know is my area of expertise in psychology, in addition to the clinical realm, has to do with risk assessment of environmental hazards. In fact, that was my dissertation topic. There was a time when I was conceivably one of the top authorities in the world on that. I've shifted from that a bit, but know still a fair bit about it. The first challenge is technical. You know, when the folks who were building Hanford originally did so, they had to hurry. They were up against the force of Nazi Germany, and they didn't have time to fill out environmental impact statements and conduct scientific studies about what would happen to the waste they would create. Nor did they have a great wealth of money that they could spend on that. They just didn't have the luxury of that. So they, in haste and understandably, created a mix of materials that we had never seen before, and we didn't have knowledge of how to deal with. And understandably, they left that to our generation to try to clean up. But it is a tremendously daunting technical task. But the technical task creates two problems. How do we do it scientifically? And politically it creates a problem because the general public and frankly politicians would rather spend their time worrying about Social Security or Mark McGuire's home run total than about fissionable materials and half-lives of plutonium. So it's a technical challenge to us. The second challenge is economical. This cleanup is not expensive. In fact, cleaning up Hanford is probably going to be one of the most expensive public works projects in the history of humankind, certainly in the history of our nation. And that is coming at a time when the mantra in Congress is balance the budget, which I believe it should be the mantra in Congress, but the party in power also believes we should produce huge tax cuts. When we still have a leftover mess to clean up, you have to wonder about the wisdom of promising large tax cuts when the cleanup process is being underfunded. Which raises a third reason Hanford cleanup is slow, and that's psychology. You know, I mentioned my doctorate dissertation was about risk cleanup. A couple of things happen in environmental cleanup. The first is people tend to not recognize that the risk applies to them, so that you can go into floodplains and ask people, what's the likelihood you're going to be flooded out this year? First, oh, it never happened. Well, I remember a gentleman spoke a couple years ago right here in this district and said, I must be getting pretty old now. I've lived through 3 100-year floods. Our estimate of the probability of risk is not very good. More importantly than that, perhaps, is a process we call denial in psychology. And it works something like this. I don't want to believe I'm at risk, so I will deny that a risk exists. Which raises a very interesting political challenge. We did, at the start of this campaign, I got together with groups of people, and we talked about issues. What issues are on your mind? I'm very, very concerned about Hanford. Very concerned about it myself. I believe it should be a top priority for politicians and elected officials in this area, a top priority. But when you ask average voters where Hanford stands, you get a very interesting reaction. You might think, well, they'll be apathetic. You might think, hopefully, they'd say, yes, thank God, somebody cares about cleaning up Hanford. But the reaction, in fact, is often much different. The reaction is sometimes a backlash, and it goes something like this. Look, every day I go to work, and I come home and I take care of my family. This is the reaction you get. I want to spend my time thinking about my job, thinking about my car, thinking about my family. That's what makes me happy. That's what I should live for. And they're right about that. And now along comes some politician and says, no, you shouldn't be thinking just about your car and your family and your job. You should be thinking about the fact that there are incredibly dangerous materials upriver that are threatening your health. Now, which would you rather think about, Mark McGuire or what I just said? I mean that very, very seriously. You face a risk, one faces a risk as a politician of not only not inspiring people, but having people reject you because you're talking about things they don't want to hear about. And that's a problem as a politician. Which brings us to politics. I mentioned earlier this is a public works project, but it's not your typical public works project. We're not going to have a highway or a bridge or a national park. It's hard to imagine huge double-walled tanks at Hanford with a bright sign on it that says, the Richard Doc Hastings Memorial Double-Walled Tank, or the Brian Baird Glass Vitrification Facility, complete with the radioactive symbol right below it. This is not good politics. And if it's not good politics for the folks at home, imagine how important this must be to people who control budgetary committees who happen to live in Georgia or North Carolina or Tennessee. What do they care about cleaning up Hanford? They care about tax cuts. They care about one more weapons program in their own backyard. They care about whatever it is that will motivate their voters, and Hanford is awfully far away. And tax cuts are awfully more appealing. So what's the challenge? Well, it's going to take guts for a political candidate to deal with this issue. Guts because people don't want to hear about it. Guts because it takes time away from all the other things you're supposed to be dealing with. And it's going to take leadership. We're going to have people who can go back to Washington, D.C., the other Washington, as we like to say, and tell people, look, this is important. We have a moral responsibility to clean this up. We did not create this mess, but we have a moral responsibility to clean it up. And our people in the Northwest should be able to think about their jobs and their families first, and they shouldn't have to think about that, about this problem, and that's why we're here. I want to welcome you to this district. I wish you great success in your efforts to get this cleanup, continue moving forward, to take care of the folks who live downwind, to get the adequate funding, to move the scientific process forward, and to solve this problem once and for all. Thanks for letting me join you.
I would say that our speaker has a sine qua non for anybody who wants to be in public office legitimately. Candor. And I appreciate it. There was less bullshit in that than almost anything I've ever heard from a candidate. Because it really was right on. You said it exactly correctly. Yeah, it does. It takes enormous courage for somebody who's in elective office to be candid, to understand and make it clear. It took enormous candor and enormous courage for those people who stood up against racism and were in the South. And there were people who did it. So, you know, he has candor, and I believe he will have courage. At least I hope so. And thank you very much for coming. Our next speaker is a person who I had not met until today, but he has a remarkable resume, and he is following in the difficult footsteps, in a way, yesterday, as his friend and colleague Russell Jim, but he also is going to attempt to give us from a somewhat different perspective the view of Native Americans as to this kind of issues, and he has some very specific background. He's the Watershed Department Manager of the Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission. He has degrees in fishery management. He has provided leadership and management of the Columbia River watersheds, and he coordinates and assists with 5 Native American tribes in the restoration and protection of fish habitats, etc. He has also served in various positions of authority on the Confederated tribes of the Umatilla Reservation, and in public life, in public positions of considerable importance. Donald-Sampson, we're very happy to have you here, and we're really looking forward to your remarks.
Fortunately, I'm not running for office like Brian, but it's good to hear his words. I was the chairman of the Umatilla tribe for a couple terms, and was able to focus a little bit on the Hanford issues. Met with Secretary O'Leary a couple of times, attended a couple of the summits over in Richland on Hanford, and was involved with some of the political decisions that the tribe had as far as addressing Hanford. So Today I'm here as a member of the Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission. I'm as mentioned, a biologist there, working with watersheds. The Intertribal Fish Commission is comprised of the Yakama Indian Nation, the Confederated Tribes of the Warm Springs, the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla, and the Nez Perce Tribe of Idaho. Those are our members. It was established in 1977, almost 20 years ago, as a technical arm of the tribe, and our main emphasis is the management and protection of fisheries. And so today I want to talk from that perspective as it pertains to Hanford. Many of you know that the tribes have treaties that were signed in 1855 with the United States government as sovereign nations, and that these treaties are upheld in numerous case law that exists today. They're valid today, and it's something I think kind of a new angle perhaps that we'll begin to explore in my discussion. The other thing is that, of course, we have usual and custom fishing areas on the Hanford site, all up and down the Columbia River, from the headwaters to the mouth. And I think importantly is that the tribes are now discussing future fishing opportunities because of a number of reasons. One is the decline in salmon populations in the Columbia. Tribes are beginning to look outside of their current commercial fishing areas to areas above and below those, including the Hanford Reach. And so that may have a significant effect on developments for both the future use of the Hanford Reach once and if it's ever cleaned up. I think a couple things that Brian Baird was talking about is important in terms of connections to the political leaders in this country. And it's about salmon, and you have to think about salmon in terms of where they go, where they migrate. These populations we're talking about here are critical populations both regionally, nationally, and internationally. As you know, today numerous stocks and species of salmon are threatened or endangered. They're on the decline, and many have already gone extinct. Many have gone extinct. Particularly in the Snake River, we have one sockeye that's returned. We spent millions of dollars and we have one sockeye that returns. But fortunately, the fall chinook and the Hanford Reach are relatively healthy. They're the only relatively healthy natural spawning population of fall chinook in the entire Columbia. Matter of fact, they comprise almost 80% of all natural spawning fall chinook in the entire Columbia River. That's how critical they are. They're the most essential, sustainable, harvestable population in the Columbia River. And there's a number of harvesters that have concern about that, and that's the political connection that you need to start looking at. Why have they sustained themselves, you might ask? Well, there's a number of reasons, but two that are most critical is that we've been able to maintain the quality and the quantity of the habitat there. As you all know, it's the only remaining free stretch of river, and that habitat has been principally the main factor behind the continuing population. The second thing is that we've used hatcheries to supplement that population. And there's two hatcheries that are there that have supplemented that population for over 20 years. So you might think, why am I talking about fish? But we'll get to the connection here soon. Just to let you know, the habitat's protected there, of course, because of the Hanford Nuclear Reservation on one hand, in terms of controlling some level of development, but the other thing is the Vernita Bar Agreement, which was developed in 1988. And basically what that does is it regulates the flow from Priest Rapids Dam, from those dams above it. So in the fall, when the spawners return, the dams are regulated for the spawning population of fall chinook. at the lower elevations and for incubation in the winter and spring. The second thing is that these populations have been supplemented by hatcheries to almost 6 million juvenile fish per year. A lot of people in the basin talk about means to restore salmon, and what you have there in Hanford Reach is one of the best examples of restoring salmon and maintaining salmon populations. You have good habitat, and you've been able to supplement that population with hatcheries in an appropriate fashion. The other reason that these populations are significant is the harvest. Ocean harvest. As you know, these fish migrate out into the ocean past the coast of Washington, Canada, and up into Alaska. They migrate thousands of miles out into the ocean. They're called the upriver brights, and they're a critical component of ocean harvest off the coast of Washington, off the coast of British Columbia, and Alaska. They migrate in the ocean from 3 to 6 years and into the northern coastal waters of Alaska. In the 1980s, nearly 70% of the Hanford Reach upriver brights were caught in offshore fisheries in Alaska and Canada. These are multi-million-dollar fisheries, critical to Alaska's economy, British Columbia's economy. They're comprising a significant share of the harvest allocated under a treaty, which is this international treaty known as the Pacific Salmon Treaty. Our tribes are members of that. The United States government is party to that treaty. And as weaker stocks, such as those in the Snake River that are endangered, are protected, these stocks, such as Hanford, become even more critical. And they're targeted on by fisheries in southeast Alaska. For example, in southeast Alaska, the troll fishery, there's some 260,000 fish that are caught there. Almost 16% of those were from Hanford, Fall Chinook. And what's the connection? Well, there's a senator up there who oversees appropriations. And by gosh, he is concerned that any populations in the Columbia begin restricting his Alaskan fisheries. So I think there's an avenue to explore for you who are involved in the cleanup of Hanford to begin looking at people like Senator Stevens and Murkowski to say that the health of this population, and he knows it, the health of this population here in Hanford Reach is so critical to your economy that you better start paying attention to it when it comes around appropriations time for cleanup. So I think that's something that you all should explore and perhaps consider. As you know, these populations have gone up and down. In the 60s, there were 20 to 30,000 that were spawning there. It went to a high of 88,000 in 1987, but it's beginning to drop again. And now it's looked at under this Pacific Salmon Treaty as a stock that is not rebuilding. And so again, those people in Alaska are looking at it very critically, as well as people down here in the States. The other thing, as you come in river, this stock is the last remaining commercially harvestable population. The lower commercial fisheries, the tribal commercial fisheries, and it's a very important sport fishery in Washington. It's the last treaty commercial fishery on the Columbia River. And that's where the tribe's treaty rights, I believe, will come into play as we move down the road for restoration of salmon and for the cleanup of Hanford. This stock is overseen by what's called the U.S. v. Oregon Columbia River Fish Management Plan. Parties to that agreement are the federal government, Fish and Wildlife Service, National Marine Fisheries Service, the 4 Columbia River Treaty tribes that I work with, and the states of Oregon and Washington. That's now under renegotiation, that plan. It's a court-mandated plan, and it's based upon treaty reserve fishing rights and the protection of those rights. This population is going to be under a microscope in that renegotiation in terms of protection of habitat, and the rebuilding of that population. I believe that the future of main stem tribal fisheries will be determined by the Hanford Reach Fall Chinook, including, as I mentioned earlier, options for returning to usual and custom fishing areas in the Hanford Reach. And what that means to common citizen who lives in Richland is that if the tribe decides that they want to go fishing up there again, we can access those areas without hindrance from private ownership. That's a treaty law. So it's very important to fisheries in the Columbia Basin, in the United States, and in Canada. And make the connection with those powerful senators, such as Stevens, to say, look, if you don't do something now to start cleaning up Hanford, those populations are going to fall, and your fisheries in Alaska are going to be affected. The other thing is, over the past 18 years, you read in the Oregonian, the region has spent billions of dollars trying to restore salmon. We have a major investment occurring in the Columbia River, and it's going to increase over the next few years. The tribes, the states, the federal government have slowed the rates of decline of salmon populations. And in some cases, we have rebuilt salmon populations, such as in the Umatilla River Basin, where I'm from, and in the Hanford Reach, because we have that quality habitat. We're currently spending, or supposed to spend, $435 million a year restoring salmon. And it may increase to as much as $700 million a year, beginning in 2001. There are some major decisions that affect salmon and the Hanford Reach in the next 2 to 3 years on the operations and existence of dams on the Snake and the Columbia River, particularly the lower Snake River dams. Multi-million, perhaps billion-dollar decisions that are occurring to save salmon. Numerous scientific panels have supported the need for natural or normative river habitats, the flows, the water quality, the quantity, as the keys to restoring salmon to the Columbia River. And the Hanford Reach Fall Chinook and the habitat that is there has been the key evidence of this need, and perhaps the cornerstone of evidence for rebuilding salmon populations. That's how critical it is to the entire Columbia River. All of these investments and these concerns point to the importance of the Hanford Reach and the Fall Chinook and their critical protection right now. And all of you all are working on this, I know. In May of 1996, the governors of Oregon, Washington, and Alaska convened their salmon summit in Sitka and called for the protection of the salmon spawning grounds at the Hanford Reach under the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. Our tribes, the Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission, recognized the Hanford Fall Chinook as the most critical population for the exercise and protection of their treaty fishing rights. We begin to talk about the impacts of Hanford to salmon, but we also need to look at the impacts of Hanford to resident fish, such as sturgeon. Numerous scientific panels are now calling for the protection of the habitat and an improvement of flow regimes to increase the productivity of Hanford Reach Fall Chinook. It's important that we move expeditiously to protect the Hanford Reach, to clean up the ground and the surface waters that are contaminated at Hanford, particularly those contaminated groundwater chromium plumes. I heard someone mentioning that U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services is studying that. Well, it's sufficient to say, and I was reading in one of the pamphlets, that the chromium levels are 25 times known levels to cause acute or immediate effects on these salmon populations. These salmon populations that are regional, national, and internationally important population, that we must proceed immediately without undue study after study, because that's what's occurring in the Columbia River. when we talk about salmon, is we study and we study and we study. And even when we get conclusive evidence, we have the opposition coming out with their spins on it to say, well, it's not conclusive enough. I've looked a little bit at the Columbia River Comprehensive Impact Assessment, and I think from my quick view that it's something that needs to get moving. I know we talked about the Columbia River as an index of the government's trust responsibility to the tribe. How are they moving forward in addressing that? This impact assessment, if it is done correctly and with full participation of the tribe, I believe can be very effective. We have to get tribal scientists, perhaps with the Columbia River and Tribal Fish Commission and the tribes of Yakima, Warm Springs, Umatilla, and Nez Perce involved in that. So the other thing is that we want to begin moving the tribes for the protection of this area as wild and scenic. I know there's been a lot of discussion about the legislation that's coming up, but we support that designation. And we think that it's important that we move as quickly as we can for that. I know that the counties and those people in the area expressed their concern about them managing it. Well, I don't have the confidence in their abilities. So I guess to summarize, when you begin to look at the political factors, and as the tribes begin examining more closely their options for protecting salmon, the Hanford Reach Fall Chinook populations are going to be at the top of that list. And I believe that more and more the protection of that habitat, whether it's protection from plumes of chromium from Hanford or the regulation of dams at Priest Rapids or above there, that they will begin to play their legal cards more closely and more aggressively to protect that population and to protect that habitat. And I think the other thing is that to consider how Alaska can perhaps be leveraged to address cleanup at Hanford. So with those few words, I just want to thank you for listening to me. I hope to get involved more with the toxicology and contamination study, and I think our watershed department will be working more closely with the tribal programs so that we can monitor that, and we hope we can get involved with the assessment that's coming forward. So thank you very much for your time, and good luck.
Our next speaker is Blaine Harden. The bio notes at the beginning what is a very parochial but still relevant part of his CV, which is that he's a Washington State native. Well, that's more important maybe than some of us who weren't originally Washington State natives understand. He's also currently the editor of the New York Bureau of the Washington Post, which means more to those of us who see the Post frequently than it does to those who does not. But it's, of course, one of our, obviously, national papers and a paper of very considerable significance. He's had a lot of experience at various parts of the world and locally in political and international affairs, and he has received numbers of journalism awards, all of which are stated here. He is here today, or maybe not all of them, but enough of them that it's almost embarrassing to list them. He is here today because he has written a book that the reviews of which I've read, but which I have not read, but which I understand is a great book, called A River Lost, Life and Death of the Columbian. It's out there to be seen and purchased and looked at. And he is here most of all, as I understand it, because he has this multiple insight. The insight of a Washington native, an insight of a very astute political observer who has his feet and his head in the areas of reality, and as a person who has a very real commitment to the reasons that we are here today. We welcome you very much, Blaine Harden.
What I want to try to do in my comments is put Hanford in a context. And I would like to talk about why I think that Hanford is probably best understood not as some part of the Cold War, but as a culmination of 50 years of federal involvement in the Columbia Basin. If it's seen as a separate problem, I don't think that people understand it properly. The federal government arrived in the Pacific Northwest in a big way in the 1930s with the very best of intentions. Grand Coulee Dam, a place where my father found a job and a future as a well-paid union welder in government projects along the river, was a power and irrigation plan intended to ease the pain of the Great Depression and transform the desert of the Columbia Basin into a garden. And in many ways it worked. But in the course of 5 decades, as we all know, there was a slide from public works projects that saved the common man to clandestine schemes at Hanford that contaminated him. In the process, also, as we know, the Columbia was transformed from the biggest wild river on the continent and the world's premier salmon resource into a series of puddles between concrete plugs. All this was a puzzlement to me when I came back to the Columbia Basin in 1993 to work on this book. I'd been out of the Northwest and out of the country for most of the previous 20 years. And I came back to write a book, to be actually around my mother and my father again after a long absence. And what I wanted to do was to explain to myself why this had happened, why there'd been this strange bastardization of good intentions along the Columbia River. And what I did as a reporter, which is what I am, I traveled around and talked to all kinds of people in all different fields, irrigation farmers, river bargers, utility executives, Hanford engineers, downwinders, Native Americans, fish biologists, just about anybody I could find who lived near the river and cared about it and knew a lot about it. And I also talked a whole lot to my father. It's important, I think, that I explain that I could not have gone to college or anything like that if the federal government had not been raining an enormous amount of money down on the Columbia Basin when I was growing up. In fact, I think the figure is that 10% of the entire public works budget of the United States government was spent in the Columbia Basin, where there was 0.4% of the country's population during the 50s and 60s. That's when I was a kid. My father worked, as I said, at Grand Coulee Dam. He worked at Hanford for a number of years. He worked at Wanapum Dam, and he worked at several other federal projects in the Columbia Basin, all of which he saved money so I could go to college. And I should add, for the sake of fairness, that I worked one summer myself at Grand Coulee Dam. I was paid $5 an hour in 1971 to work as a laborer on the third powerhouse project, but I got fired. My foreman, a man named Tex, explained to me that I spent too much time sitting on my butt, so he told me to leave. The people that I interviewed along the river for this book, what united them, including my father, was an alarming legacy of anger, fear, and intolerance. The intolerance was the one that surprised me and that actually saddened me as I worked on this book. And let me talk about some of the people that I interviewed and tell you what they said. I met in a pancake house in my hometown of Moses Lake. I met an irrigation farmer by the name of Bernie Erickson. And we were having coffee, and he was explaining to me that he was an endangered salmon. He said that irrigators, like salmon, die without abundant water. He said they also die without subsidized electricity to pump the water, and without crop subsidies so they can make a living once they do grow the food. He was furious at federal bureaucrats who were beginning to change the rules, cut the subsidies, reduce the amount of water he could use. And he was also furious at salmon lovers, salmon-loving liberals, as he called them, in cities like Portland. He's furious at people like you folks out there. He said they'd forgotten that all wealth comes from the earth. And he was almost apoplectic that the subsidies that he thought were a birthright were starting to change. And it's very hard for him to see why. I talked to river bargers out on the Columbia, the ones that go up and down here, traveled with them, and they told me that it wasn't dams that killed the salmon. They thought it was sneaky Japanese fishermen out in the Pacific, or that seals at the mouth of the Columbia were doing most of the damage. And one bargeman, in a bravado fit of honesty, lectured me on the selfishness he said pervades the entire Pacific Northwest. And let me read you his comments, because I think that they sum up a lot of the lack of compromise that one feels in issues related to salmon and to Hanford. He said, quote, "Nobody wants to give up anything. I don't want to give up my job. The farmers don't want to give up their water. Consumers don't want to give up cheap electricity. I ain't never seen a dinosaur, but I don't miss them. Who says it is not evolution killing these salmon? Who cares anyway?" And then finally, at Hanford, where I spent a good part of my time in reporting this book, which is just not too far south of Moses Lake, I met two people who were smart and likable and warm and friendly in the way that Westerners pride themselves on being. One was an electrical engineer who spent his career at Hanford, and the other one was a downwind farmer. They did not know each other, and I never brought them together, but they hated the very idea of each other, and they made that clear to me. Tom Bailey, the downwinder who farms around Mesa, Washington, he asked me, and this is a quote, he said, "Did you ever see the movie Deliverance? You know, those Appalachian squirrel hunters, those retarded inbred guys with funny looks on their faces? Well, the cast of Deliverance is living in Richland and working at Hanford to this day." And then I spent a good amount of time with Jerry Erickson, who quote, a retarded inbred guy. And he's an engineer and actually a really nice and smart guy who devoted most of his professional life to the N reactor at Hanford, which is now closed like all the others. And he told me that downwinders, people like Tom Bailey, are a sad symptom of a poorly educated nation. He said, quote, "It's just a matter of ignorance. I think our society is technologically in the dark ages. These people think Hanford is like some kind of science fiction movie. I don't understand a public that can be led down such strange alleys." This morning I'd like to offer up 3 tentative reasons why we in the Columbia Basin have gone down such strange alleys, and why these people along the river are so damn mad at each other. They were in '93, and I think to a large extent a lot of the people are still mad at each other. And my three reasons go to some, I think, fallacious assumptions about what it is to be a Westerner and what progress means. First thing, progress. Federal involvement on the river was driven by a pernicious definition of the word progress, I think. For decades, it meant nothing more or less than conquest. As the Bureau of Reclamation so brutally put it in their official slogan, total use for greater wealth. Everything in the Columbia Basin, its rivers, its great empty coulees, its fertile but arid land, was nothing more but nothing less than an engineering problem. Rivers especially, the Columbia and Snake especially, were electricity and transportation and irrigation machines. Nothing more, nothing less. What is also very important to remember in this definition of progress was that it was almost universally accepted by every single person who lived out here in the Pacific Northwest in the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, and most of the 80s. The people who didn't, of course, accept this definition were Native Americans, but they were powerless, so it didn't count. But this was a very popular idea And the idea has only come into for criticism, really, in the past 10 to 15 years. Rivers, of course, are not machines, nor are the fish that swim in them. The costly and endless fight over dwindling salmon is probably the best known consequence of defining progress as conquest. And I think the perfect symbol of the stupidity of this definition is the migrating salmon smolts who are distilled out of the river at dams that are fish filters, very expensive fish filters now, and put in barges for their journey down the Columbia River. It's just the perfect symbol of what's gone on. I think that the second fallacy here is the Western notion of self-reliance and how it's come to mean something very strange and very poisonous in the Columbia Basin after the federal government began raining money on the region in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. The myth of self-reliance in the Pacific Northwest context and in the context of all the big river basins in the West is one that is full of self-contradiction. It depends on other people's money, by and large. It's a prideful self-reliance that, precisely because it makes no real sense, is often expressed with anger and intolerance. Historian Bernard DeVoto's brilliantly captured the creed of the subsidized, self-reliant Westerner. It's get out and give us more money. As someone who grew up inside this absurdity and who benefited from it, I have thought a lot about its costs. And I'd like to read just a very short little passage from my book on my thoughts about this while I was writing the book and after having spent about a year here talking to all these people, including my father. My father was my inspiration for this book, and he did not like the book, as a matter of fact. Odd as it may seem, growing up in a place that owed its very existence to federal money, I cannot recall anyone ever saying anything good about the government. In our house, my father explained that the federal government was run by a bunch of thieves. They ought to take those bastards outside and shoot them. This was not just my father's opinion. It was a sacred incantation in irrigation country. We were federally dependent and federal hating, and we never gave it a second thought. As I think back on those years, there was an even higher level of paradox and of delusion. However much we resented the federal government, we never seriously challenged what it was doing. To the Columbia River, at Hanford, or anywhere. Although we never talked about it, never heard about it at school, and never acknowledged it even to ourselves, the price we paid to prosper in the engineered West was powerlessness. Faceless experts from the Bureau of Reclamation, the Army Corps of Engineers, the Atomic Energy Commission, and the Department of Energy did what they wanted and kept as many secrets as they wanted. They operated without local challenge or local understanding. All they had to do in return was give us regular work. The way we lived, the way working people lived across the engineered West, has been described as the managed oasis life. In Rivers of Empire, historian Donald Worster writes, their conformity, speaking about the community that I grew up in, writes, their conformity, their lack of self-confidence, and their thirst outweigh any resentment they may feel towards those in power. The masses will, in gratitude, agree to make no trouble. The rewards of acquiescence are so high. In my family, the rewards of acquiescence were to go from being failed farmers in North Dakota and Montana to being middle-class people who had a couple of cars in the garage, a house with 4 or 5 bedrooms, and enough money in the bank for the kids to go to college. And that brings me to my third and final point, which gets at why Hanford and the salmon issue still provoke such rage and why resolution seems so far away. Between the 1930s and the 1980s, as the federal government was building more and more dams on the Columbia and Snake, as Hanford continued to spill radioactive crud, as irrigation farmers came to see their many subsidies as a birthright, there was an air of not knowing, of not wanting to know, that enveloped the Columbia Basin. During this era of not knowing, an era that incidentally coincides rather well, I think, with the Cold War and with the era of not knowing in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, where people were manipulated by very large bureaucracies. During this era, I think the healthy, self-regulating habits of a democratic society were forgotten here in the Pacific Northwest, particularly around the Columbia Basin in eastern Washington and eastern Oregon. For decades, the press never challenged the irrigators, the river plutocrats, the Hanford managers. The media mostly just applauded the flow of federal money. Elected officials at the town, county, state, and federal level behaved more or less the same way. And citizens were locked out. They didn't understand what was going on. They did not form community groups to hash out what should be done. They didn't learn, and I think this is a very important point, they didn't learn through practical involvement in the use of grassroots power that compromise, give and take, win and lose is an essential part of making public policy. The ice broke at Hanford, and I think in the entire region, with a terrible crack in 1986, when the Department of Energy was forced to release documents about the atmospheric releases and the other releases at Hanford. What leaked out then, and what is still leaking out, is paranoia and resentment and intolerance. The downwinders, I think, these people who recently had a setback in court, are the perfect example of what has happened. People who described themselves before the mid-1980s as patriotic Americans who never doubted that the government had their best interest at heart, woke up in the late 1980s in the Columbia Basin and discovered that their beloved government had been secretly poisoning them and lying about it. The ramifications of that for those people are almost impossible to overstate. I remember going to a mall in Walla Walla and sitting with about 24 people, all of whom claimed that they were sick because of radiation leaks from Hanford. And whether they were or they weren't, I wasn't equipped to know, but they believed they were. They were infected with this paranoia and this distrust of their government. And it had changed the whole political culture that they lived in. And on the other side of the river over in Hanford, there were others who, there were the engineers, people like Jerry Erickson, who simply thought these people were crazy. And there was no mediating institutions through which they could work it out. The downwinders are still furious, perhaps more so now than ever with this court decision recently. So what is happening at conferences like this, I think, is part of the solution, the part of the waking up process. And it's going to take a long time. I think if you look at what's happening in the former Soviet Union in Russia, and to some extent in countries like Romania or Bulgaria, where there are very few habits of democracy. In a certain way, I think that's what's happening here, is things go so slowly, there's so much anger, there's so little efficiency in resolving these problems, because the habits of democracy have been forgotten during this long period of not knowing. And I think it's going to take quite a few more years before these habits become second nature again here in this region. It took 50 years for this thing we were in the dark for 50 years, and we've basically only been in the light for 10 or 15 years. So things are going to go slowly. It just seems inevitable. The one thing that when I came out here to work on the book, I was so astonished that 3 years after, when I finished the book was 3 years after I started, and virtually nothing had changed. And I guess the only thing I can say is I don't think that things will change very quickly in the next 10 years, because it's the processes of learning how to negotiate and compromise, it's just a slow business. I think I'll end by talking about, I talked to a Native American who lives near the Wanapum. He's the head of the Wanapum tribe, a very small group of Native Americans who they live right beside Priest Rapids Dam in this deal they cut with the Grant County PUD. They live just next to Hanford, and just up over the hill is the Army firing range, and they frequently hear the impact of artillery there. And then just upriver is orchards and some tourism that's all sort of surrounding them. And the entire little village of about 30, 40 people, they hear the whine of the dam all the time. And it's one of the strangest places in America to live, it seems like to me. And I asked Rex Buck, how they put up with this. And he pointed out that, it wasn't a great situation, of course. But he pointed out, too, that they had cut a deal with the Grant County PUD so they could fish in the Hanford Reach. They could gather roots and do some traditional medicine stuff up on the Hanford firing range if they made sure that they weren't shooting. And they survived. And he felt that he and what was left of their tribe were better off there than they would be in some city, becoming like me, he said. Well, that was a bad thing. But what he said his advice, his final advice, and this will be the epitaph for this little talk, he told me, I said, well, what advice do you have for people who are trying to figure things out in the Columbia Basin? He said this, he said, quote, "Do not try to resurrect a river that is gone. Make a realistic bargain that preserves what can be saved of the Columbia and its salmon and its spirit. Make an agreement and abide by it honestly." So thank you.
Okay. We're going to have a 5-minute break, and then we're going to come back and look at a video with commentary. Russell Jim. You want to comment? I think you should. If not, come up here.
Hello, yeah. Blaine, did he take off?
He's here.
Oh, I see. I appreciate your book. I've read it, and it gave me a lot of insight into what had taken place on the river. And it took a lot of intestinal fortitude for an individual like yourself to do such a thing, at least in my estimation. For instance, in '94, well, first of all, I'll say that in the book, it enlightened me that when you said you were coming down the gorge, it was no odd event that you were facing 40-mile-an-hour winds during the day. And during the evening, it was no odd event that all of a sudden the wind was behind you. In '94, I wrote to the Richland office of the Department of Energy asking for information on how often the wind blew down the Columbia River. And they sent me a document after about 5 months, and it stated that was still in a classified mode. So I appreciated your book, not only for its full content, but for that little particular portion. My concern in Don's presentation, there seems to be, I'm afraid, an implication that Hanford is a pristine area that is viable for the raising of fish. That may be true, but then again, it may not be. The 80% that you mentioned is but a small portion of what used to be there. So that is a concern. And with the continuation of adding a hatchery fish, a inferior genetic strain, is going to continue to put a major strain on the native populations there. And there has to be indeed studies, as you mentioned, a study about the chromium, which is a bad actor. For instance, and my general concern about the gene pool of the Yakima and the future generations, no one knows whether or not the gene pool, the memory genes of these smolts may be affected, and many of them may be going out to sea and don't know how to come home. The point is, as you mentioned, the continued studying of the issue is abhorrent. 2 years ago, the director of the Untitled Fish Commission told me there have been $1 billion spent since the Northwest Regional Power Act of 1980, in which, in 1980, at markup, we determined there was nothing in the act for the preservation and protection of the fishery, and by some miracle, 28 amendments were added at the 11th and a half hour. But yet, $1 billion was spent only to study the issues. There was nothing done to preserve and protect the fishery. And so it's, I'm hoping that the message can be gotten to the powers that be and these people here, you know, and their efforts and their work that they're going to be doing would continue to show the disconcerting, the disturbing, whatever acronym you may want to put on it, what has happened there at Hanford, and may not be the best interest of any fish until there have been adequate studies done. Thank you.
Thank you, Russell. Well, don't you think we ought to start it right now?
Yeah.
Okay. Why don't you introduce it, because I'm going to go to the John.
Okay. I think because of time constraints, and we have a video that we'd like to show, we'd like to go ahead and put this video on. And let me quickly explain, it'll become self-evident what it is. But about 2 weeks ago, a number of us, scientists and engineers and activists, decided just to go take a look at the Hanford site from the perspective of the river. And we were fortunate enough to have with us a professional videographer and producer named Jim Morissette, who produced the movie Hoop Dreams, as well as A Farmer's Wife, which was on PBS last week, and did a very, very fine job of producing a documentary, this trip. And we thought this conference would not be complete without giving folks here a chance to see Hanford from the river. And we are fortunate to have some talented people with us. And I think without further ado, I'll ask that the curtains be closed over here and that the lights be dimmed. And let's watch this video, and then we'll go into hearing from Norm Buske, who has done some examination of the river shores and the river waters in the past and recently, and into our panel. And if you know how to do that, yeah, there we go. So thanks. Let's start this video up. Leaves that he was harvesting there. Without further ado, I'm just going to leave it to Norm Buske.
Thanks, Tom. First, I would like to say that video is just an incredible job. It's really, really difficult to get something like that to work out on the river, which does its own thing. Let's see, the theme of this is a river runs through it, and we've actually seen that in several ways. The video is, of course, one of them. Helen Caldicott's discussion at the beginning of the whole thing was a different overview of it, and the Native American perspective, of course, is a different view. And let's see, what I'm going to do now is yet one more view. As you can see, whatever it is, there are many ways that the river runs through it. And this particular view actually begins with Russell Jim. In May of 1983, he called together some environmental public interest groups in the Northwest and invited them to the Yakima headquarters and said the government's planning to put this high-level waste dump under Hanford, and I think, you know, that needs a little attention. And as a scientist, I took a quick look through the government documents, and what you look at is what they don't want to look at. You say, my goodness, there's this groundwater thing, and it goes into the river. that's the Columbia River again. And one says, well, we can sample that. So they may not want to look, so why don't we? And what I've done then is I've put together a slideshow, and my hope on this is, rather than little points, that you won't worry about the little points, and I'm going to go through it pretty fast, and if you just sort of sit back, I hope this will work, and we'll just chug right along, okay? I'll need the lights out for that. And the starting point is always to step back. And this is an overview, if you will, of Hanford and the Columbia River. And the Columbia River runs into the Pacific, okay, the Pacific Ocean. And so we're going to just look at a few things on the Pacific region, we'll call it. These are important test sites. Well, this all looks pretty strange, doesn't it? These test sites, let's see, I'll identify a couple of them here. Here's NTS, that's the Nevada test site. That's where the U.S. does its underground nuclear testing. Let's see, Amchitka, that's an island in Alaska. Do you remember we just heard about Alaska and the salmon? There are these connections. We'll come back to Amchitka in a little bit. That's the U.S. again did the world's largest underground nuclear test there. Down here is Mururoa. That's the French nuclear test site. There are these funny little initials here. PNNL. Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, a test site. It's right next to FFTF on this thing that we call Hanford, right next to the Columbia River. LANL, Los Alamos National Laboratory, another test site. Over here, LLNL, Lawrence Livermore National Lab. Why is he calling these test sites? Well, there's all this connection. It's the U.S. nuclear complex we're looking at. If you think I'm drawing some connection that doesn't make too much sense, look at the U.S. DOE newsletter and you'll see the connections. They list these things all together. They're all part of the same picture, and the river runs through it. This is a little closer look at the river running through it, and we're down here, and here's PNNL, FFTF, where they would like to make some more nuclear weapons material. Here the tank, I suppose Helen Caldecott would like us to call them ranches. And here's the pathway from the tank ranches over to the river. Here's the end reactor up here. And my story really starts in 1983, getting Greenpeace. Greenpeace had the logistic capability. This looks like a Greenpeace action, inflatables. We're out in the river, and we collected samples at the shoreline. This is from H reactor, seeps into the river. And Karen Dorn Steele at the Spokesman Review, and this is November of 1983, radiation furor ignited. And this was really where we got into it technically. And what we were doing was building an alternative technology. I don't know if you can see this very well. It's a little dark, but it says repository. This is the location that the Hanfords, as we called them, wanted to put the nation's first high-level waste dump almost directly under Purex, where they could make bombs out of it. Back at that time, we didn't really know much. And so a lot of what was involved looked a lot like this. Lovely background, isn't it? Beautiful river. And what we were doing was looking for seeps into the river. And we knew that we had, from these tank ranch areas, and the bee pond it's called, we knew that we had out here that the Hanfords had seen at a well called 40-1 sudden jumps in tritium about a year and a half to 3 years after they would dump tritium in bee pond, and here it would be out here close to the river. And so what we were trying to do is discover where it went into the river and what's going on. And this is what it looked like for about 6 months. Well, a lot of what we learned at first was actually during joint sampling in 1985 with the states of Oregon, Washington. Sometimes the tribes sent representatives, EPA, and it's a fairly large undertaking, and we learned to sharpen our approach a little. The date on this is 1963, and it's what really the government knew in 63, and they argued these broad, slow-moving plumes, hundreds of years, all that stuff. Here's well 40-1. This is 1963. That they had the well data. they knew that they had something going on here real fast, and yet they drew these broad, slow-moving pictures. Gee, we really don't know. Does this sound, 1963, sound like the present time? And we were really upset in 1985 that they were playing this game because they'd been there before. And one sees it again and again and again. It's a new day, we're looking forward. And so eventually, and this is, again, eventually we found at River Mile 28 that this is a plume of sand being lifted up from the bottom, the boulders in the bottom, by the water coming into the river there. This is an underwater television. And one of the arguments was we would never be able to find it and we couldn't see it. So back then what we did was build an underwater TV, and we got the media, these is Channel 2 media from Spokane out, and we put it on TV in Spokane and said, yes, we can find it, thank you. And so we located it, and then and this is what it looks like in the video if you drop the river level. And there are these boulders. They're called the Pasco gravels, and this is where we have these springs that come out. And what we needed to do was get a travel time. It was really, really important for that question of locating the repository. How fast does it go from the 200 East area to the river? DOE was committed actually to 30 years to 100 years at that time. The usual arguments out front that all the governments used, French, Russian, British, the Americans, is 1,000 years. If you have a question on how long it takes to go from a mess to the public access, 1,000 years. Anyway, we're down to, they said 30 years to maybe 100 years. Well, we didn't believe it. And in order to do measurements, what we needed to do, we needed to get the average river flow so that we could make an average measurement. And for that, we made arrangements with all of the agencies that control river level. This was in April of 1986, and we needed to have the river taken to 112,000 cubic feet per second and held there for, it's about 4 days. And so in the middle of a flood stage, we needed it locked at average annual flow. The flood was out here, they brought it down, this is 112,000 is that cubic feet per second. They held it for us, and then it went back to flood again. Real strange thing to do on a river as large as the Columbia. And we always had a huge amount of help from the river control people, and it made all of this possible. And so we did an average flow rate measurement by, first thing you do is set the river at average flow, which is a wild concept technically. What we wanted to do is measure, and we used nitrate as an indicator. We had all this nitrate, and it's a tritium plume, but it has lots of nitrate, and easy to measure the nitrate. And it comes out of this, what we had was basically a channel theory, and we spaced off 852 feet, and these are stations out here where you make measurements upstream. The river's flowing down, and then we had another section down below with these, and we'd measure nitrate and then current flow. Now, next we'll look at this downstream section. See, this is a picture. This is reality. We're looking out. These are those stations out in the river. We measured nitrate and flow, and this is the nitrate measurement. This is our laboratory out at River Mile 28. And once we had the riverbank storage out, that's why we had to hold it so long. First you get large flow because of the storage. Once you have the riverbank storage out, we had 6.3 cubic feet per second. With the it was the flow out of that channel. With that, we could back calculate. And the basic picture of what we're looking at is they dump wastes from the 200 East area and the 200 West. It goes down basically as long as it takes, which wasn't our interest at the time in the Vados zone. And then how long does it take the groundwater to get over to the river? And the answer was, and this is our model of what Hanford was, and unfortunately it still is, and we modeled it as a big sieve where they dump all this contaminated water and everything else they feel like into it. Their argument was 30 to 50 years at that time to get to the river. What we showed with a very conservative study was 3 to 5 years. The tritium data for fastest pathway was about 1.5 years to 3 years. So it basically, as soon as it hits the groundwater, it's in the river. And so what we were looking at, the low levels of contaminants in the river were what had already reached there from, 2, 3, 5 years before. With that done, what we needed to do was learn a little more about how that whole system works. And one says, oh, because one listens to the Department of Energy, and it's this incredibly complicated thing, and we just have to study it again and again. What we said was, well, let's just cut through all that and get it worked out. And they have good data up at Priest Rapids, that's upstream. Down here, they have some nice precision data on the west bank. But in order to calibrate for like what we have coming in at River Mile 28, and then there are some other springs down here. In order to calibrate that, we have to know how fast the river mixes across. So we had to do this precision river mixing study, and on paper. And so you always, with Hanford, you start with 100,000 pages of paper at first. So that's why I include the paper stuff. What we did was use drogues, they're called. They're these little floaty things. And so we don't have to pollute the river. To do a dispersion or diffusion measurement, we use an array of these, and with survey techniques, we can very precisely tell how quickly they mix across the river. This is what it looks like in reality. This is a drogue array. It's spreading out across the river. We survey it in and get a cross-channel diffusivity on it. And that lets us account radionuclides through the whole groundwater system at Hanford, primarily N Springs, the River Mile, which is strontium-90, River Mile 28 tritium, uranium down at 300 area. We had this worked out by fall of 1987, so that this whole process of doing independent science on it required, it was about 2 years. And it was fairly expensive. It cost probably a total of $50,000. So you can see the sort of magnitude of getting a scientific handle on Hanford and how long it takes if you have unlimited resources or something. Beyond that, the next thing was we understood that Hanford basically was this window on Hanford wastes. It's also, of course, a window on their management, unfortunately. And the next thing was to really look at the details of it. And by the way, this is a picture, an aerial picture of, these are some trenches that they were working on, and you can see the sort of nature of it. You dump things in the trenches near the river, and then they just sort of percolate down, and you have seeps down here, was the idea. And well, we'll just sample all those seeps. So we took a look at the seeps and also dived the intake structures to see if they'd lost any fuel rods accidentally overboard. And this was in 1989. This is one of our larger expeditions with Greenpeace. And this is sampling at N Springs. The rule was you had to it's navigable water, so you had to stay in the navigable water. My feet are wet. I'm navigable and navigating. And there's a seep here down. This is a disposal trench or line. It's a channel, disposal channel, and there's a little seep into the edge. And I'm collecting a sample from navigable water of the seep into it at N reactor. This is what the uranium springs down at 300 area look like. There's a muddy bottom right there, and so they just come gurgling up. These are mostly uranium in them. When we were done, we were able, now this is a picture of Hanford, and these are river miles, these little lines here, and then up the big bars on top of them and at this edge are the amount of contaminants. These are gamma emitters in the different springs. And this is 1989, and we basically had a handle in on what the seeps looked like. The problems we had were up in the K area. You've already heard of that. The N springs are the outstanding example of, a real problem right at the shore. They also have a problem with the hexavalent chromium at H. It's the same sort of thing, only chemical, and I won't go into the chromium, but they have this, it's the same, they're not looking, and so on. This is Hanford town site. This is that channel I told you about. Down here you have the 300 area seeps. So we had basically looked at all the seeps by 1989. The problem that we really saw coming in there, and has already been referred to, was that the strontium-90 on an exponential curve was growing so fast with their disposal methods that they were going to make the river undrinkable for strontium-90, the whole thing. And they refused to look. And it was really upsetting, actually. This is N reactor, and these are their discharges that they had operating in the late 80s, where basically it was a diffuser discharge. These are the mulberry trees. This is 1301 trench. See where they dump it's fuel from the cool down on the reactor fuel from end reactor. This is 1325. And then they see it just runs down underground, right? And emerges. And they put boulders over the shore right here so that it didn't look so bad. And then you have the mulberry trees on top. This is picking mulberries. Linda was working with me at the time, picking mulberries at high water in May of 1990. We spent the rest of that summer trying to get the state, DOE, EPA to address the issue. We had these materials sitting there and we said, this is not good. What are you going to do about it? And after 3 months they wouldn't. But the answer was they thought I would go away. And so we made mulberry jam, and that was already described. I brought a bottle of mulberry jam. It tastes good. And let's see. The other thing is that we had other stuff out of End Springs. This is curly dock. It's an edible green, and the curly dock, this is what your background here sounds like, okay? And the curly dock sounds like this. And the state, we had built a lab at the time. The state came and inspected it and actually offered to confiscate that. Didn't think the public should have that. That's a little bag of curly dock. The messenger lives. This is 2 weeks ago, September 18th, 1998. The mulberry leaves were what were out there. Those mulberry leaves have 32,000 picocuries per kilogram of strontium-90 in them. That's 4,000 times drinking water. Those are your numbers. The messenger says the problem is still with us, and we're not gaining. Okay? Back to this picture. Now we're going to look at a couple other things and come back to Hanford. Down here, what we had done at Hanford, in addition to developing this sampling system, was we had also built a laboratory because you couldn't get analyses done commercially or at universities. We built a laboratory, and we could go out every week and sample at Hanford. The French had blown up they mined Greenpeace's ship, the Rainbow Warrior, in 1985 in New Zealand and sunk it. And Greenpeace was having trouble working out how to go back and do something about the French. And so we developed the laboratory capability in conjunction with Greenpeace and had it mobile. This is the new Rainbow Warrior, and we built a laboratory amidships on the new Rainbow Warrior and built a Gamma Lab board. And before sailing from San Francisco, this is standard technology. We had satellite photos taken. We used Landsat and specified the photos of this is Mururoa, the French test site. So we got a set of these are clouds over here, almost cloud-free pictures of Mururoa to help plan the scientific investigation. After showing they had cesium-134 seeping out into international waters, we went in to go to the source. The French were unenthusiastic. I think you get the picture. They busted the venture, and that was the first time I was taken prisoner. The second time they were less happy, and they destroyed all the film and took all the samples and everything. Let's see. Now I'll go to this test site was closed down. Greenpeace went back in '92. The public and Greenpeace, the world public pressure, closed that finally in 1995. Huge, huge, wonderful victory for humanity. This is the site of the world's largest underground nuclear explosion. Cannakin, it's called, in 1991. Greenpeace was founded in opposition to Cannakin. I was invited to do a scientific investigation for Greenpeace's 25th anniversary in 1996. This is us landing on Amchitka Island. This is the fishing boat we arrived in, and of course the inflatable. And we took samples showing that americium-241, that's a daughter of plutonium-241 decay, is leaking into the aquatic environment on Amchitka from 2 out of the 3 tests, including Cannakin, and into the Bering Sea, which is the world's largest fishery. Alaska does come into this. And it was never supposed to leak into the aquatic environment. It was supposed to be, you guessed it, 1,000 years to the marine environment, under the seabed, wonderfully diluted. It looks to us like actually this leakage is mostly washed out already because the flushing was so fast. It would have been a few months. Last year, I oversaw a U.S. Department of Energy study that was to confirm or deny. These people are EPA. This is Aleutian Pribilof Islands Association representative, and DOE and the state of Alaska. We had a large sampling program. This is Cannikin Lake. Cannikin Lake is the crater from the collapse of the world's largest underground nuclear explosion. Basically, what we did is we, Americans, blew the island apart. And what we found under DOE's study that they spent $1 million for was that they confirmed the results, only they refused to publish them and instead went into a cover-up mode. You know what that's like at Hanford, and sought to destroy their data and then refused to publish them. And so we had to finally publish their own data. They still have not published them. They promised the public they were going to go public a year ago, and they just kept putting the dates off. I'm sorry. Let's see. This was a confirmation study confirming the radioactive leakage. So we now had federal data that showed it. The subtitle is The Threat of the U.S. Nuclear Complex. And this is a 1997, 1998 cover-up, and I got to oversee it. And so what we did was chronicle the cover-up. And you guessed it, it's the same thing you see at Hanford. But for the first time, we had the U.S. nuclear complex. It isn't just a site, it's the whole complex. This is the way that the U.S. DOE manages its cover-ups. And what do we have to cover up? And this is Hanford's product. That's what it's all about. Think of FFTF, more of the same. And where does it affect one? And the answer is down here. And it's, are your children in this picture? And see the risk, I'm also a risk assessor type, and the risk is spread over generations and over centuries. And that risk is so great over those long time periods that if we do not basically dispose of the arsenal that we're holding, it is going to go off. And Helen Caldicott already described the consequences of that. And let's see, I'm at the present time, Nuclear Weapons Free America is who I am, and it's a continuation of the Greenpeace USA nuclear campaign, which was shut down last year. Thank you.